Ian, is there something that you were proposing we do first before we, actually before you go into this? I think what we want to do is kind of resolve our questions about what is the information telling us. We're going to come to a point in this conversation where I think we need to talk separately about the Tranche 2 overlay on this and what we feel we need to do about that as almost a separate, obviously related, but a separate issue that is on the minds of, I know, a number of the councilors. So why don't we try to wrap up our understanding of what's the data telling us, and then we'll move on.
Yep, so Chair, I just suggested that perhaps, I was just chatting to Simon, sense a bit of confusion around what the information is telling us. So Simon's just going to clarify a couple of points, and then, we could probably then leave that behind, and Malcolm and the team can talk about consenting and policy. And of course, Mark is still in the room, can talk about sustainable homes.
Yep.
Okay, so there's a couple of points I want to just go over quickly, because obviously there's some concerns about these declines. So one of them is a 101 message, which is that around the equilibrium and how do we do it. So from about 2009 to about 2012, as you know, we created a numerical model. This is not a simple exercise, it's complicated. It involves a lot of data points, calibration to get a good fit on what's going, so that we have confidence in what our predictions are doing. So that's helped inform Plan Change 6 and establish these minimum flows and what's going to happen when we pump on those flows. And that's how we came up with the allocation limits of what we proposed and what the commission's accepted. So these are just some worldwide examples, just showing you, look at what does happen when you pump. These guys are pumping 100 times more volumes than what we're pumping from their systems. You can see in these cases you get declines and they reach equilibrium. Our modelling, if I go forward, it's a bit of a complicated thing. If I go back, shows here what happens when we pump to this 24 million cubic metres per year. So this is change in storage. Think of change in storage as being reflected in terms of groundwater levels. So you go up and you go down. And so this is around about 1998 when we start ramping up pumping. And what you see in the system is an overall loss of storage. And at about 2005, 2006, it starts to stabilise. So the model is indicating that we shouldn't see much increase in declines over time once we stabilise our pumping. We need that information to see what's going on at the moment. This was through estimated use, so once we get more information, it can help us improve those models. But the model is showing that we will reach an equilibrium. Worldwide data shows that that's what happens. Our pumping's only about 10% of the actual input into recharge into the model. It's a small component. Declines aren't going to go forever. I'm not too worried about them. So I wanted to reiterate that although we're seeing declines, we have a model. The model's indicating that they will stabilise, and they will stabilise quickly once the usage is capped.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah. Sure.
In the tank process, we went through the exact same sort of analysis in a much more, I would argue, transparent manner.
Sure.
And we came to a day where the presentation said to us, look, we have established that we are magically at this perfect equilibrium point.
Yep.
And just our data, our modeling, which you're saying we have to take with a grain of salt,
yep,
is telling us that we are right at the point of equilibrium. Therefore, no new consents on the Rotanafoot Plains for water.
On the Haratonga. On the Haratonga.
I'm sorry, on the Haratonga. No new consents on the Haratonga. And everybody sat around the table and sang Kumbaya. We're all agreed, water users, environmentalists, Maori, all parties agreed that we have a shared understanding of the hydrological situation, and we're prepared to make a pretty massive policy call to say no new consents. This has been a contested process all along, and it seems to me we still have a long ways to go to establish what you're saying, to the satisfaction of all the parties involved. I mean, I'm sitting here with a weekend's, pile of papers from people down in Central Hawke's Bay who would basically say bull
Yep.
to what you just said. So there's not a hell of a lot of buy-in down in that part of the territory. And that's not a criticism of the work or anything, but that's just the reality of the state of play here as to when you say probably not mining. We could fill the gallery here today with people who would say,
Yep.
you're wrong.
Sure.
It's not a question, just an observation
Yeah,
that
you're
this
right.
is not as resolved as your charts would suggest it is.
Chair, perhaps one other just important bit of context, or perhaps a reminder, is that in the Plan Change 6 process, and I accept that the whole groundwater modelling was heavily contested, and at the time it did cause anxiety, but usefully, as Simon said, a company by the name of Aqualink, on behalf of the user group down there, went away and effectively built their own model of the basin. Independent of ours, used shared data, and probably some of their own, built their own model. The two models told exactly the same story in terms of effect of allocations on groundwater levels in the overall system. So if you like, there was an independent person came along and said, I'm going to test that proposition, and went away and did the work independently. And in fact, that was the basis for which the user group were promoting the 45 million cubic metres that they wanted, that we opposed in the process. So albeit that this modelling exercise wasn't as you say, transparent and open as the Hiratonga process has been, there has been some, if you like, independent checking of that means that the two are
But you're
coming to the same
also
approximation.
telling us, though, or you're about to tell us, I think, that we're going to embark on what might take another 2 years of work to try to validate this more substantially.
It's like any science, as good scientists will never come back with the full answer, because otherwise we'll be out of work. There's always new things to find.
You didn't mean that, by the way.
Yeah, of course I didn't mean that, no, I'm tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is that science will always be imperfect, particularly of a groundwater system which is hundreds of metres below the ground. So we're always looking to invest in improvements to the model, any model we have, as we will with the Hiratonga in time. In fact, we'll be doing that off the back of the SkyTem, the electromag work that we're going to do across the Hiratonga plain. And we're going to do exactly the same for Rotanewha, because it would be irresponsible not to. And if we find that modelling tells us things that we hadn't known at the point this policy was developed, it'll come back to you with the recommendation to take some action to change it. That's just the way it works.
But this model is based on 24 million estimated abstraction. We now know it's 28.5. That's allowed. That's another more than 15%. What impact is that going to have?
So there's about 4 scenarios they ran for the Tuki plan change, and one of them was full allocation. I think it might have been 43.6 million cubic metres per year. And so what that on a simple term shows is, yes, you get increased loss of storage, which equates to changes in groundwater levels, but you still get that equilibrium occurring at close to the same time. The message from the model is that it occurs quite rapidly once you stop increasing your usage and you flatten it out. That's what the message the model's saying. So even at double the model at 24, not quite, but 43 that was used in one of the scenarios, it showed the same message. That's what it's indicating.
Chair, could I? Sorry, just before you do, Debbie, I'm just wondering whether it's helpful for you to clarify for all of us, Simon, that following that allocation, while we reach equilibrium, does that quantum of allocation increase the susceptibility to climatic variation? So therefore, have we made the system more sensitive, if you like, to dry years? And therefore, shallow bores like Ongaonga are therefore more susceptible.
They will be more sensitive in terms of, so as you pump more and you take more from storage, certain areas of the system, the groundwater levels will go down. And then you're starting off a lower point. So then when you get your El Ninos and your drier conditions, of course, you're now going to be more sensitive to lower groundwater levels during those times because you've already decreased your storage in those areas. Like I said, it's complex. It's not uniform across the basin. It depends on where you're taking water and where you're irrigating. So in some places it will be worse where you've got higher pumping and the right conditions for it. In other places it won't be worse. It varies. But yes,
And more
will be
amplitude.
more amplitude as you increase pumping.
Do we have climate predictions were built into the modelling in terms of understanding
I think-
recharge?
There was a period of time that was repeated in time,
Yeah.
saying this is what we're going to see, and so they tried to just look at the increase in pumping effects to isolate it.
Peter, did you have more that you were going to quit? Or?
No, Debbie.
And Councillor Curtin?
Yeah, just for my, sorry, Debbie, you're okay.
Okay.
You go.
I would just be quite keen to hear you say on the camera, Ian, the reason why you do the modelling in the winter. I thought your answer over our after morning tea break was helpful to some of the questions I've been fielding in the community. And then I just have another question after that.
So the question was, why are the pump tests conducted in the winter? So to test the effect of, or the interference effects of takes on nearby bores. The reason you do it in winter is that typically in winter there's no other irrigation occurring. What you want to understand is the effect of that bore and that bore alone, not that bore plus whatever other irrigation's occurring around it. So you do it in the winter to avoid those what we call confounding variables or other impacts that you then have to try and manage. So that's what's done in winter, which is always problematic because you've got to get rid of the water at the time.
Thank you. That's important to clarify that. Also, when you speak about the modelling, I'm not seeing it come through consistently. You know, what will the effect be on all of the parties? And when I say all the parties, I'm meaning surface water takes, and that includes village, community water needs and expectations, the tranche 1, the potential tranche 2, and the impact on the river itself. I need a bit more of a picture for that to come out of that modelling. Is that going to come?
So it's already been done. So again, during the Plan Change 6 process, Rob Walgen, he done a number of reports on the security of supply and what it would mean in terms of increased minimum flows. That was all part of the modelling exercise that went through the commissioners. That's how they came to the decision and said, look, we're going to cap it at the current level because we said, look, that any more pumping is going to have an adverse effect on those surface water flows, and that modelling work was used to inform that decision. So there are a number of reports that we can provide you with statistics on the effects of those pumping.
So
Council, sorry to interrupt, we'd be very happy to spend a bit of time with you if you wanted to get more detail, like with a one-on-one with the team, just to kind of give that explanation. Because in simple terms, the very simple thing that was managed for in the system is, as Simon said, you change the storativity, which has the effect of, does two things. It depressurises your spring flow, so the amount of water coming out of the ground naturally, and it also impacts the amount of water going out of the basin at the Raukawa range. So the overall system was managed for two things. One, to prevent the groundwater disappearing completely, which that's not happening. And then the other is to manage the effect of the overall groundwater abstraction on surface water flows. And the modelling work that the team did combined both the groundwater and the surface water modelling in a coupled model to be able to describe, if you do this to groundwater, what's the effect on surface water. So that, in large part, was the driver for these allocations, is that at that level of allocation, here's the predicted impact you're going to have on surface water flows, which obviously then impacts on ecological values, but surface water users as well. So all of that was an integral part of the science and an integral part of the framing for the policy development.
I know we're going to get to the tranche 2, so I won't go to there, but I mean at the moment we've got a problem, and we're still looking back to what data was put into the Board of Inquiry a number of years ago, and it's been acknowledged around this table from the science team that the Central Hawke's Bay District Council failed to represent the community residents of Onga in that process. So how can we fix it now?
So maybe that's moving into maybe that's a nice segue into the kind of policy and consenting discussions and then sustainable homes. Chair, at your
So hang
discretion.
on a second, Councillor.
Just a couple of questions, just to help my understanding of the data. The model was concluded or developed and implemented in 2012, is that correct? Been functional?
The transit model was completed in about, I think it was 2010 was the transit model, but the model scenarios might have been 2011, 2012.
Sure. So can you tell me the model has been in operation for what, net 6 years or so? How accurate has it been in predicting?
Can't tell you that.
You can't tell that. The other question is, what's the evidence to show that, in fact, the system is in equilibrium from the model?
I don't think the system is showing that it's in equilibrium yet. So the model's showing that it is going to reach equilibrium, but our monitoring data is saying it's not there yet.
So when's it saying that it will be?
It's saying that if the pumping rate was at 24 million cubic metres per year, that by about 2017, it's not really showing it on this, the model has pretty much reached an equilibrium by then. That's what the model was saying.
Sorry, 2017.
That's what the model was saying.
So we should be seeing equilibrium
Well,
now.
there's a number of variables in that, and one of them was this 24 million cubic metres per year, if that's been used. That was an estimate. Is that
So
correct?
one of the key issues, Councillor, is that as with any modelling, you have to kind of put data in, you make some assumptions around what's going to happen. So the assumption was that you would allocate 24 million cubic metres and that would be fully utilised every year by every user. That's not the case. That doesn't happen in practice. So
Sure, but you'll be able to insert a new base of...
we could do, yeah. So we could go back and remodel it and say,
Sure.
look, let's assume that only 12 was used every
Yes.
year.
Yes.
But what the work did was to take the, if you like, the worst case. What if everybody did use it every year fully? What would happen and when would it happen by?
Sure. Just a technical question around your comment on the timing of measurement. I'm just seeing the 8th of March as the last measurement date there.
My apologies. This is from a climate survey presentation template. That should be deleted. Ignore that. Yeah, that's for when we do our monthly climate surveys to people. I usually put the last measurement of that groundwater level so that they know what we're up to.
So the data is relying on winter measurement.
Just ignore that. That's got nothing to do with this
Okay,
data.
just confirm with me that...
You were talking about pump testing, different.
Pumping test, no, that's just, so the pumping test information provides information about the hydraulic properties of the system, such as the transmissivity.
Sure, yeah, and I get all that.
No,
Yeah.
the groundwater levels are measured right throughout the year.
Every
The
month.
question before specifically related to pump testing impacts on proximal bores.
Sure.
So, and the pumping, the pump test information is used in the modelling process to help constrain the properties that are used, and also the groundwater level measurements go in to help calibrate what is the actual hydraulic conductivity, etc. So it all gets fed into the model to help inform it. And it doesn't matter whether you use it in winter or summer, the hydraulic properties are the same. You just get more confidence when you use water levels in winter because you don't have the interference from other wells.
But your answers you've given to those, my line of questioning, hardly enable you to come to a conclusion that we are probably not mining.
How?
I'm not convinced that what you've just told me about the model and its validity at the moment has enabled you to come to a conclusion that we're in a state that we could be described as probably not mining.
Chair, look, I'd just reiterate the point that was made earlier on, that the model was run under 4 scenarios, including one which was full abstraction at 50% more than is currently consented, and under that modelling scenario, it still reaches equilibrium. So the science advice is that on all of the allocation currently provided for and some, equilibrium will be reached. So a mining situation doesn't occur in terms of taking more than is coming into the system. The level at which the water table settles on average certainly goes down as a consequence of abstraction. And in terms of the communities of Tikokino and Ongaonga, that essentially is the key issue, is that the water table has now come down as a result of the last 20 years increase in irrigation activity. And the policy that could have been in place had there been advocacy around it that Councillor Hewitt referred to, potentially in Plan Change 6, was a preclusion of a significant body of abstractive use for irrigation in the surrounding areas of those townships to ensure that those water tables didn't drop. Now that would probably, at a guess, be a very large spatial extent with a significant economic cost associated with it, and that would be something that decision makers would need to weigh up. This was to some extent considered by the Board of Inquiry, as I understand, and the view was taken ultimately in the policy that came out, that actually, as long as the whole system was in equilibrium, the surface flow issues were provided for in terms of where final allocation went to, that actually some lowering of the groundwater levels was an acceptable effect, albeit that it has an impact on some individual households. And that, I guess, is the uncomfortable reality for that community.
Good summation. Can we?
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the graph, the top one, is it estimated extraction or is it actual annual abstraction? Because the graph's got two comments on it.
Oh, this was taken directly. Sorry, I had estimated abstraction. This was taken from Hassam's report, who's the modeller, and it's estimated. It's estimated abstraction. So it's a combination of meter data and then having to go what's the likely estimated actual pumping over that time. So it's estimated because we don't have the data from 1990, 98 going through. We've only started metering probably 2010. Where's
2010.
2010.
The
So,
comprehensive television metering is relatively new.
Okay, because that would have been, again,
Very useful.
very useful to have that information out because, again, you know, you're looking at something that is an estimate of usage in 2009, which is going back 9 years ago. So, in that respect, the model the model is the one that's down the bottom, isn't it? That's the expected model. So so when was that modelled up? 2013. So
2010.
2010, whatever. So have you put actuals in there to try and calibrate it, make sure that it shows a pretty fair indication?
The model was used for the Plan Change 6 implementation to set the limits, and that's what it's been used for. And we've moved on to the tank.
Yeah, so that's the bit of work that I mentioned earlier that we're running now is a review and a refresh of the model. So putting it into a modern platform, adding in new information. That's work. Okay. That's going to happen very shortly.
Okay, so can we move on to the next stage here?
I've got Paul Barrett sitting up here as well. So Paul's involved in a lot of the consent processing in the Ruatani stuff and is more au fait with this than I am. What I just wanted to touch on was Plan Change 6. So a lot of this conversation's gone around already. Plan Change 6 gave us those Tranche 1 allocation limits, 28.5, and then it introduced the Tranche 2 entitlement or availability of another 15 million cubic metres of water that can be taken from groundwater with some conditions, including there should be some offset of the effect of that take during periods of low flow. So from an allocation point of view, from a consenting point of view, we've got the 28.5 is fully allocated. We're basically on that number. And so there's nothing more to allocate as Tranche 1 water. If someone relinquished their consent and made it available, we could allocate that as long as we stayed at the 28.5 and didn't exceed that. The 15 million cubic metres has all been applied for, and more than that has been applied for by 8 applicants, and that's in process.
Did you say 8 or
8 applicants. So that's sort of some background. So the plan sets that up, and so we're not really testing the allocation, the question of allocation. We're saying the plan has basically given us that direction. There's 2 volumes of water that can be allocated in total across the Ruatani Whare Plains for abstraction purposes. When consenting the Tranche 2, we've got provisions in the plan to look at the effects of that on streams and on adjacent groundwater takes. So we can still look at the effects that the localised effects that a take might have, but we're not so directed to look at whether that water should be allocated, whether that 15 million should be allocated. So that's in process, and I'll just step on to just touching on the policy also that's in the plan, which is around efficient bores. So
excuse me, Mr. Chairman, those applications for tranche 2 have been publicly notified?
no, not yet. We're asking for more information from the applicants at this stage. So some of these questions you've been asking, we've asked of the applicants to say what effect is this going to have individually and collectively, and how are you going to augment your, as is required by the plan, how are you going to augment the effects during the low flow periods?
Well, if they survive and proceed, will they be publicly notified?
We're waiting for that information to come to us before we make that call. So we're not presuming it will be until we get the full information lodged.
Councillor, where you're headed is likely to be a subject of a motion and resolution in the course of the afternoon here.
I think it'd be most unwise not to publicly notify.
The second point I was going to make is around the efficient groundwater take policy in the RPS. Basically, there's a provision to say that that we shouldn't protect inefficient bores, inefficient groundwater takes. We should protect efficient groundwater takes. So there's a judgment to be made about what is an efficient groundwater take, and generally the principle is that if the bore doesn't penetrate the aquifer adequately, such that it's not going to be able to take water all season, it's probably not an efficient groundwater take. If it's relying on a surface pump, the bore's struck down to something like 30 metres, but it's relying on a surface pump, so it can only access water for the first 7 metres, then that's not considered to be an efficient groundwater take. So the guidance in the plan is basically let people access water. It's a large resource. If we protect the people taking water at the surface, the top of it, we won't be able to actually access more of that resource within the limits that are set. So when it comes to Ongaonga, the question then becomes, there's quite a lot of takes which are shallow. Bill Stevenson, I don't know if he actually said it to council, but he's spoken to me since and said that he has deepened his bore. He's got a deeper bore. It goes down to about 30 metres. He used to have a surface pump, which would draw down to about 7 metres. He's now put a submersible pump in down to 25 metres. So in doing that, he's basically he has a bore deep enough in the aquifer to access the resource, and now he's got the ability to take that water through the pump. So we would, in my view, that would be an efficient bore. So we should be protecting access to the water when it's set up in that manner. But ones that are shallow, the policy wouldn't give the same protection to, and would, if as we saw those graphs, if the water table was drawn down through abstraction, we wouldn't be saying that those shallowest bores or ones with takes which are only taking it right at the surface should be protected, and there would be a need for there would be no protection being provided by the regional council, and if people wanted to rely on that as their source of water, there would be a need for them to adjust their means of taking that water. That's probably my summary.
Do you have any statistics on the concentration of water use? I mean, if there are X number of consents out there under a normal Pareto formula, 80% of the water could be used, irrigated water could be taken by 20% of the users of that water. And in fact, there have been some Information Act requests to try to get into this issue. Do you have any sense of who is actually using the water? What is it? 20 consents using 80% of the water? Do you have any data that would permit you to calculate that?
We could calculate that, but off the top of my head, I don't know if Paul's got an answer. We keep a running total of all the water that's allocated in the different areas. We could.
So is it possible that someone could fairly argue to us, this is a question, is it possible that someone could fairly argue to us that commercial users of water, of water takes, have basically gobbled up the lion's share of the water available to the detriment of people who need water for their personal residential use?
You could certainly demonstrate what different, whether it's commercial activities, so what percentage of water is allocated to irrigation, for example, versus allocated to others. I guess it's judgment as to whether it's gobbled up or to the detriment.
I understand I used a word that's loaded.
That's sort of the judgment in this, sort of to what extent do you allow further abstraction of the resource to people's benefit at the expense of others? And
because one could say that the definition of efficiency is very existential, and a bore that's efficient last year might not be efficient in 5 years. Why would it not be efficient in 5 years? Because we've allowed commercial takes of water that have made it inefficient.
Yeah, so to me it's counterintuitive to then say your bore's inefficient, when in fact it's us consenting extra abstraction which has caused it to become inefficient. So whose fault is it?
I guess I've mulled that over slightly in here. There's a question of when do you draw the line between saying it's a tolerable effect and when is it actually not tolerable and there should be some offset or compensation for the effect.
Well, I would believe it'd be intolerable when you can no longer use what was an efficient bore for donkey's years because of some other abstraction. That to me would be where you need to draw the line, because the people of Onga and Tiko are the ones that are bearing the cost of past decisions made by this council, obviously.
When I make the observation, I think the term efficiency is particularly problematic in this circumstance.
Absolutely,
I actually think what we're talking about is the resilience. If you have a shallow bore, it will have a low level of resilience inherently, particularly if it is just below the historic water table level. And if people drilled only as deep as they needed to go to get to water, they have an inbuilt level of low resilience. And I think the situation we're in at the moment is that we do have a number of households where that is the case. And so I think using this term efficiency is just a bit of a red herring. The question I think this has posed is whether the council has an obligation to protect all infrastructural assets regardless of their resilience. And you can think about comparisons and other forms of infrastructure. And in terms of any legal obligation, there is not a right for anybody and everybody to be able to access water at one point in time indefinitely, as the resource profile changes, either whether that's be climatically or due to abstractive use. But I understand that the communities of concern in this case are feeling like they're on the losing end of a trend in allocation over the last 20 years. And indeed, I think there is some truth in that in terms of they are being impacted. And then the question I guess that raises is, does this council have any obligation to assist beyond the Sustainable Homes program that we're putting on the table? Does the district council, that has the primary responsibility for the supply of potable water to communities, have a responsibility? Or do the irrigators themselves, who are the prime beneficiaries of the extractive use of this water, have any obligations to remedy or
I'm glad you added them to your list.
Or mitigate. And look, it's not uncommon, obviously, when we issue resource consents for a range of practices that as part of their offset or their strategies to remedy or mitigate, that they are required to make good on their impacts, whether it be providing funding for some other remediated source. So arguably when these consents were issued that could have been perceived to have an impact on low resilience infrastructure in the townships of Ongaonga and Tikokino, that a condition was put in place that they contributed to the costs of people drilling deeper wells. That's with the benefit of hindsight. It certainly doesn't seem to have been the policy or practice in this case. So we're left with this conundrum where these water rights have been issued under these consents, and people have gone and made investment decisions on that basis. And I guess these are holes in the existing policy or deficits in the existing policy.
Right. So stepping forward and looking at tranche 2 water, is it within our power, for instance, to make it a condition of the grant of consent, if that's where we get to, that where our modelling is telling us that a groundwater take that's been pumped from the surface in the past is not going to be possible in the future, that it's a condition of the consent that gets replaced with a submersible. Is that possible? You thought about it?
It could be possible, but conditions have to reflect an adverse effect that the consents are causing, and so
hence the modelling.
Yeah, but I mean the people with surface pumps have got a problem now, regardless of tranche 2. It's already, and as groundwater development increases just under the tranche 1 framework, you can expect there will be further declines. So those bores are, I know we don't like the term, but they are, under the policy and the plan, they would be considered inefficient. As it stands today, that's obviously changed over time as water levels have declined. So because of that policy, it may be difficult to argue for mitigation for those surface pumps. But the degree of effect that the tranche 2 takes have on other bores and streams, shallow bores included, is something that would have to be assessed.
Councillor Hewitt.
My question was along the same lines as what James said. Why is avoid, remedy and mitigate not part of the consenting regime? Because to me it just seems grossly irresponsible that we are not protecting individuals who's, we're talking about people who live in villages who have struggled, a lot of them have struggled to put in additional infrastructure to attract the water that they need for their own dwellings, and now they're at risk again. So there's a lot of emotion in this debate that's coming from the community. But I think, James, you did answer that with that could be a potential outcome of the consenting process in the future.
They could get free milk. Thank you for that contribution.
Could I just ask the
Can you
question?
shower in milk?
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Could I just, I hear the concern, I've spoken to a number of people over a period of time, but what I'm trying to get my head around is that we've got a dot, things change. For example, a ball went in, sometime later the groundwater shifted. People draw a direct line between the two, and what I've been challenging myself to do and to find out here today, is there a causal connection between the two? And given that the ball went in the period 6 to 7 years after the ball went in, the graph shows no material change particularly. And 6 years after the water course was diverted, no material change either. So where is the connection between the two? Is this just a natural phenomena?
Well, I think we might get a response from Simon or from Ian on this one in terms of the technicals. But my understanding, and it's the advice that's in the paper, is that the pump tests done in relation to those specific bores in relation to both Ongaonga and Tikokino there was no observable direct effect. However, we're seeing across the whole aquifer an abstraction regime develop over the last 20 years that is bringing down the water table. But there is also some climactic variability over that, and until we've got probably several decades of data being able to determine what is climactically driven and what is the result of abstraction is probably going to be reasonably difficult. So I don't know that the science is necessarily going to rule in or rule out a relationship between abstraction and what people are experiencing in Ongaonga and Tikokino.
But to follow off that, the next thing for me is there's now being seen is some liability or connection between the council giving consent for a bore which can pump at this stage and then in the future is unable to pump water, that is now somehow the council's responsibility, or indirectly the council's responsibility for letting others pump, so that the consequences are being shared out. So it seems to me there's been an implication of an implied liability here, or a guarantee that the pump will continue to operate at this level, and if it doesn't, we are then required to mitigate that.
Well, look, that's right. And if somebody has a low resilience piece of infrastructure, a little bit like building a house beside a beach or a river, what is our responsibility to guarantee that they don't suffer any loss? And so this is part of the balance in this. And I suspect that the Regional Resource Management Plan and our consenting processes is not going to be the resolution to this. This is going to need to be a negotiated set of solutions between ourselves, the Central Hawke's Bay District Council, those communities, and possibly the irrigation community around them.
Mr. Chairman.
So while we have a problem connecting a well with a larger systemic impact, the steep curve that you showed there of water utilization was not caused by people taking more showers.
No.
Okay? It was taken by, the curve is based on commercial use of water, which got us to a point of over-allocation. Not on the basis of people drinking 3 more glasses of water a day. And so, you know, I take your point that, you know, a individual event might be impossible to track back, but come on, there's a pattern here. Sure. It's pretty staring us in the face pretty clearly.
Chair, that's the value of the modelling, is it gives you that assessment of the overall cumulative effects of all of the activities, which is the information Simon had up before. And just to be clear though, this isn't, what we're looking at here is not an issue with over-allocation. An allocation was set by the inquiry, and as I understand it, Malcolm and Paul will correct me if we're wrong, that's been fully allocated, but it's not over-allocated, so there's no more.
As far as we know now.
It hasn't been issued beyond that point. So it's not an over-allocation from a policy perspective.
Councillor James.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's interesting to consider the past, but I'm not sure there's much benefit in dwelling on it. The issue is what is in front of us today, and the residents, of course. Can someone give us an idea what it costs for a household to take to replace a shallow bore with one that goes down an adequate depth and install a submersible pump?
And meets the efficiency definition.
Well, it would have to.
Is Mr. Heaney able to help with that? Because it's probably going to go to the sustainable homes discussion, I suspect.
It's about $1,000 a meter and $6,000 for the pump.
$1,000 a metre.
I was going to put ring around $30,000 for a reasonably resilient bore.
30,000. That's for the bore and the equipment.
What's that? That'll be 25 metre depth.
Bill Stevenson did quote some figures to me, but off the top of my head, I think he spent about $6,000 installing a submersible pump, so he didn't have to reconfigure his bore. And he quoted others, I think, were up around $15,000 and $18,000. So I think there's in their submission they said there was something like 4 or 5 members of the residents who had basically lost access to water, and I think 3 or 4 have responded by doing something in the way of deepening or reconfiguring.
And what's the magnitude of the problem? How many households are there likely to be affected?
Yeah, no.
Well,
in the video, I think he said there's 80 in the petition, or 80 households on
Between Tikokino
so
and
115 residents signed the letter and petition, and how many of those are just concerned for their neighbours and how many are affected, I don't think we know. I think this is part of the work we need to do with the Central Hawke's Bay District Council, is engage the community. We have had a discussion previously about surveying this community to find out precisely who is experiencing what issues and see what the opportunity is for those communities to aggregate their efforts. Where we've got proximal properties, it makes sense that they would share costs and there would be only a single bore going rather than one. And I think there's also a bit of a trade-off in this about whether or not putting a rain tank or two on the back of a property and storing up from a low resilience shallow bore in the winter and having some tank supply through those particularly dry months is a lower cost option rather than drilling bores. So that's all part of the work I think we need to do. I'm meeting with the Central Hawke's Bay District Council with Councillor Hewitt tomorrow, and we will be having discussions about how we collaborate in terms of engaging that community and look at some of these solutions.
Well, Mr Chairman, it seems to me that that is the sensible path forward, to work with Central Hawke's Bay and try and find collectively a solution. And as for tranche 2, I would say be very, very careful. Beware.
Mr Chair. Well, Mr Chair, obviously we're in a position now in this discussion that we do have a regional resource management plan that enables us to do and consent the way we have. Liability is for the efficient wells or sufficient supplies is not our direct responsibility. Having said that, like all other of our policies, we do have people to deal with, and good governance encourages us to find a solution outside of our absolute obligations, and that's why the next part of the discussion, particularly around the sustainable homes funding, becomes quite important, and I hope we can move on to that now. But in comment, following on from Councillor Dick's observation, I think we're in a position to pull together all of the players, regional council, local council, large consent holders and the local residents to come up with a solution. And that's probably where we should focus our attention now. So to kick that off, I've got some concerns that the previous paper, in terms of the criteria we set for sustainable homes, has some tweaking to do in order to overcome, or in order so that it does not limit our opportunities in this situation. So I take and ask this question of paragraph 39, page 85 of the paper, which tells me that the scheme is limited to a minimum of $1,000 and a maximum of $10,000 per property, and that's in relation to water. And I want clarity as to whether in fact we mean $20,000, because the respective criteria approved earlier today is a little ambiguous in that, because that says the cost to HBC will be cost recovered minimum $1,000, maximum $20,000 for septic tanks. So Mark might be able to help us to clarify, did he mean water storage as well as septic tanks? And if not, have we got the opportunity to give us flexibility and make it 20,000?
Thank you, Councillor Curtin. We did say that we would review annually. It's gone around really quick. As far as the 10,000, 20,000 limit is concerned, that was initially put into the criteria to reflect the likely cost of interventions, where it was recognised that solar and septic tanks and double glazing were likely to be more expensive than the other solutions. So they had a 20,000 limit. All the other things have got a 10,000 limit. Now, that presupposes that the policy is, as I described it, for the collection of rainwater.
Storage.
Yeah. Now, it begs the question as to whether or not council would wish to see, in terms of improving resilience, the Sustainable Homes programme to include submersible pumps.
Well, it may not be maybe the whole system, but from my perspective, and putting on the table now, we should allow ourselves the flexibility in this policy to do just that.
Chair, if there is a high-level agreement on that, we can certainly reflect that in the paper that we bring back finally to council in ratifying the policy. But we'd take some guidance from the.
I will be. I know we all like to charge off and help people do things, and that's the right thing to do. But the regional council, as I understood it, the provision of water supplies for homes was a local authority matter, the TAs. Napier City, Central Hawke's Bay, etc. And what we're doing here is we're moving into the area of home supply of water. And if we start here, where does, just put the slippery slope analogy here, where does it wind up? And it would seem to me it also presupposes a possible outcome to the discussions which are coming up between the Regional Council, the Central Hawke's Bay and the community. And I personally like to wait for that to be heard before I made a decision on this. So I think the responsibility still rests with CHB and the local community. CHB, District Council and the local community as to what they're going to do there. Willing to be a helping hand, but I think they've got to figure out what they're going to do with their drinking water. I think this is not the only community. I remember there's significant issues in Takapau and other places about drinking water. Where are we going to get if we start on this? I'm just cautious here. I want to know what the end game is.
We've already poked our nose in. We're already putting insulation into people's houses. We transport them around the cities. We are wanting to give them some storage facility for rainwater. Here is an opportunity in my mind to go one step further.
But with respect, transport, we're required to do that by law. Central government directs us to do that. That's our responsibility, nobody else's.
Councillor, we just went through a long-term plan process where we've adopted a policy of doing just what this today we're considering how we're going to implement the policy. We're not reconsidering the policy unless you want to go back to the LTP and revisit it. So the policy is there, and we're quarreling at the moment over how generous do we want to be.
A word of caution. You could spend twice your $13 million in one hit if you tried to fix this problem on your own. It's just not feasible to consider that, and I concur with Councillor Barker. In essence, the supply of domestic water is a TLA responsibility. Now we should work with them and help if we can, but I personally think that I don't see us being able to go any further with this issue today, and staff and our Central Hawke's Bay representative should go away, talk to the council, talk to the community and try and come up with some options.
Well, there's a reality to it. Sorry to butt in though, but there's a reality to it that it is a scheme where the people pay. All we're doing is facilitating that. Where the council and the ratepayer is not asked, other than in its facilitation role, for the funding for it. And I'm suggesting that the $10,000 limit shouldn't constrain and should be available not only for insulation and solar protection, but for the supply of water to those houses that need it. I'm not seeing the downside of this.
Well, let me ask you another question. If you're going to do it for existing householders, why would you not do it for new and attending householders?
So the policy across the board does preclude new builds for the very reasons that I suggest, Councillor, you have in mind in raising that point.
If this is all about largesse and helping people and build resilience.
But I think Councillor Curtin is suggesting this is in the case of retrofits. This is where you have a poor performing bore, and that the effort here would be to improve the performance of that. I guess where this sort of starts getting a little murky is that most of what we've got contained in this policy is about mitigating environmental effects, and certainly water storage adds to the overall water availability in the pool. Improving people's access to groundwater resources doesn't necessarily provide a net environmental benefit.
Yeah, but a lot of the policy here is about human health and basic needs like double glazing and what have you. I take a somewhat different view, and I've just done a calculation, $20,000 a household times 100 is 2 million, and we've got 13 million in the pot, so to speak. So it seems to me there's plenty of headroom if we expanded the potential support along the lines that Councillor Curtin's suggesting, and I would certainly be in support of that.
Well, look, we're in no position to provide you with any advice about the likely demand of this program. It's really a finger in the air at the moment, and given that it's fully cost recovered, that there is a chance that uptake will be quite low. And so we might not face any debt limits at all. But obviously, the more we expand the policy, the more likely it is that it will be taken up in full.
It's
So
also...
we have two stressors here. Can we move on here? And your suggestion of convening the appropriate parties to deal with stressor number one, which is a number of people in a particular set of townships have a immediate water anxiety about what their situation is going to be. You're proposing we're going to go down and have a conversation with all the relevant parties, or put a working group together or something to figure out what that short-term Band-Aid might best be, right? The other, I think nobody has anything to propose doing beyond that at the moment.
Well, if I can add one thing, the feedback I've been receiving from the community is that they're not interested. They're not interested in incurring more debt, even if it's over a long-term period on the rates.
So the community's going to have a discussion, because that appears to be the only option we're prepared to offer them at the moment. The second stressor is the fear of added impact of the Tranche 2 water. So can we move on to that aspect of this? And I mean, it seems like the only proposition that has been floated in that regard has to do with public notification. I think from what feedback I've gotten, there is some misunderstanding that when we say we are processing consent applications, that we're looking to abet the process, when we're simply fulfilling what we're legally required to do, which is receive and digest and process applications as they come in. But some people, I think, are beginning to understand that's the state of play. That we have asked the eight applicants for a lot more information, which in and of itself is suggesting that the staff feels that there's a reasonably high bar to meet to be able to establish that this water is remotely available, and if so, on what conditions. And the concern of the community that I've heard was that this was all sort of rolling along, happening without anybody really having an opportunity to participate in that decision making, and that the immediate issue is a concern about public notification. And similar to the issues raised around water bottling, where our intervention in that instance was to say we do not want there to be any more water bottling consents granted, or that this was whatever the technical term is. We withdrew that delegation in the case of water bottling. So is that something is there a sentiment for doing that in this case?
Just out of courtesy to our number of students in the back of the room, perhaps we might just tell them quickly what Tranche 2 is. Simply, but
there's been discussion about the amount of water in the Rotanifa Basin being fully allocated at a certain volume, which is 28.5 million cubic meters. In the review process for the plan change that implemented that, the Board of Inquiry heard an appeal, or I guess accepted that an additional tranche of water over and above that amount, 15 million more cubic meters, could also be allocated if it could be established that doing that would not have a harmful impact on surface water flows in the region. And so once that additional quantum was established as being out there and available there were an immediate succession of applications for that, including by our own HBRIC. That tranche of water, its availability has been sitting out there as an unresolved issue now for 3 years, so more or less. So that's the issue, and so there are 8 applicants who have applied for that water. They have every right to apply for the water, and the staff is in a process of assessing those applications and has gone back to all of those applicants and asked for further information to justify the applications being made, and that's where the matter sits at the moment. But for the locals who are already feeling that existing use is compromising their situations, the specter of 15 million more being taken out for commercial irrigation purposes is something that we're finding quite disturbing and would like probably to see us do something about it.
Mr. Chairman, you suggested before you had a resolution or a proposed resolution. Could we have that and deal with it?
I think the only issue, Councillor, is the one you raised, which is at least giving the peace of mind that any further consideration of this is going to happen in a publicly notified context.
Yeah. Okay, and at the same time, are we asking our staff and our Central Hawke's Bay representative to deal with Central Hawke's Bay District with a view to coming back with options as to a means of dealing with this, the wider issue?
Yes, that's the shorter term.
So, Chair, in relation to the second point, obviously we are doing that, and if the council wishes to express its support for that, then that's helpful as well. In relation to the former point, I guess I just feel duty bound to just advise the committee that, of course, it is within your gift, and obviously it would need to be ratified by council to make decisions in relation to changing the delegations on notification of this matter, as you did with water bottling. We would prefer to provide an advice paper on that, and so rather than a decision be taken today, that you seek advice on that change to the delegation. And in general terms, just remind you that we do have a set of established protocols in terms of decisions around notification and delegations down through the organisation on that. And notwithstanding this is a particularly strategic and significant issue for the community, we just run the risk of getting into the habit of cherry-picking issues that we then make arbitrary decisions on terms of when we notify and don't notify, and it's better that we have a predictable framework for the community, for applicants, for everybody involved about what's notified and what isn't.
That's all very well, but there are issues of political sensitivity.
I understand.
That should be taken into account with the policy of the council.
I understand.
And to move things along, I'm prepared to move in both directions. That the issue of tranche 2 allocations, if they are proceeded with, be publicly notified, and secondly that staff and in conjunction with the Central Hawke's Bay representative be encouraged to deal with the Central Hawke's Bay District Council and other affected parties to bring back options to this council.
I would second that motion.
I'll second that.
I'll defer to you.
Can we have that up on the...
Would you like to speak any further to it?
It's all been said, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Barker.
The thing I would say that if we can, just as long as it's understood by the Chief Executive and the staff about the advice, understood by the Chief Executive and staff about the advice on the tranche 2 water, that we would expect a paper to come back to, would it be council, and it would be acceptable to council for the paper to come directly to council at the next meeting. Would that be okay?
That would be fine.
So it was very clear, so we're going to skip the committee process and come directly here because we had a good discussion about it. What's the recommendations on that? And the other thing that I would add to Alan's resolution by way of context is in come back to us with discussion with CHB and the Ongaonga community. That I would like us to be understand that this council wants to be a constructive party to that, and to be helpful, not just to be interested in things. We want to be picking up on Neil's point about we want to do things. I agree with him on that. My only concern is when I know what I'm in for, where the journey takes me to before I get on the train. So that's my caution there. So we want to be constructive about this, as helpful as we can. We've got options and tools here, which Tom has identified in the long-term plan, and we want to flesh them out. But where does this take us to?
Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Supportive of giving a clear direction in terms of the Tranche 2 applications. I think it's a really sensitive issue in the public's eye, and I think they want some certainty now. And I think if we were moving this motion to make them publicly notified, I think that covers that certainty. With respect to the going and having discussions down in Central Hawke's Bay, I'm really pleased that the Chief Executive has suggested that the irrigators down there be involved or a party to those discussions. I think they're fast losing their social licence to operate if they, because of the correlation that seems to be drawn between the increased use of irrigation on the Ruataniwha Plains versus the new level of equilibrium coming down below what we were in the past efficient groundwater takes. And I think they'd be an important part of that discussion in terms of, like I say, their social licence to operate within that community down in Central Hawke's Bay.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to support the other elements of this of the motion, but I'm not ready to support the element of the motion in relation to public notification. The staff are still collecting information under Section 92, and I have confidence that under their delegated authority they will be aware of the sensitivities of this matter and make the right decision once they're armed with information from the applicant. So it's my intention to abstain from that part of the motion. Chair, if you could take it separately.
This paper that's come before us today has elicited an incredibly emotive and reactive response from my community, and there are some very, very concerned people out there. I'd asked James to mention this, but one of the beliefs was that this paper was a preemptive to enabling Tranche 2 to be consented, and that was not my take on it, and that I've been assured was not the staff's take on it, but be that as it may, it has caused a lot of concern in the community. One of the things that is abundantly clear is that Plan Change 6 is no longer the solution to the environmental needs in our community that we thought were going to occur, and what we really need to be doing is going back to the drawing board and establishing some catchment management. And that's not letting a number of 7 or 8 applicants for Tranche 2 be driving the science, but we need to be taking control of the situation ourselves and going back to the community. I mean, Tank took 5 or 6 years to be having the discussion with the community. And what we're hearing in the Te Ratonga catchment, what we're hearing in Central Hawke's Bay is, there are community problems down there, and the community needs to be empowered to be finding the solutions. So I think the discussions we're having tomorrow, James, with you and I and anyone else who's interested in attending, are going to be really enabling in terms of getting back onto those community catchment management discussions where all of the stakeholders are represented, and hopefully then we'll get away from the emotive discussions that have been occurring. I have every amount of sympathy for the residents of Onga and Tiko who are having their water security needs put at risk. It was very heartening to hear that if those residents have already established efficient bores, that those efficient bores would be protected by this council. But there's been a lot of pain that's been shared in that community, and certainly if we add up the phone calls and the correspondence that's been going on, I think it's been well canvassed around the table. I'm actually sitting with Councillor Bevan in terms of not preempting the staff's role in Tranche 2. I have been given assurances all the way along that process is a process and it will be enabled. So I will be sitting with Councillor Bevan on that, and I would like you to be taking that separately as well. It's an abstention. I'm not saying I have a problem with it, but I don't think we're quite there yet. We need to be taking the directives away from the delegations that we've just approved. So yeah, I look forward to ongoing discussions with our community. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Chair, just I missed the beginning of the debate, and to be consistent with previous meetings, I will abstain from the vote, but I do fully intend to exercise my right at the council meeting.
Councillor Gurdon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for the sake of clarity in terms of the recommendations, I'm assuming that essentially we've added a second recommendation to what's currently proposed in the paper. The first one being that the Environment Service Committee receives and notes the staff report, and I'm assuming the second is that the staff provide advice on public notification of the consent for tranche 2 water, so words to those effect. Is that where we're at this point? If that being the case, Mr. Chair, I'm proposing a third recommendation, and these obviously can be taken separately because I do have some similar issues as Councillor Bevan and my colleague from Central Hawke's Bay around public notification.
Can we have these recommendations so far up on the board?
So I'm proposing, Mr. Chair, I'm foreshadowing a third recommendation that staff provide advice as to the impact of confirming the maximum funding under the scheme for water storage as being 20K. So I'm foreshadowing that apart from these two recommendations considered at the moment.
So are you satisfied with that third addition?
I don't quite understand that.
That staff provide advice as to the impact of confirming the maximum funding available for water storage is 20,000 as opposed to the 10,000 described in the paper.
And that 20,000 is for the provision of water storage?
That's
or
correct,
water
yes. According to the policy.
Infrastructure.
According to the policy.
For possible solutions to...
Sorry, Chair, I realise we're in debate, but if I could just get clarity from the councillor, are you wanting advice on the inclusion of submersible pumps?
No.
Water storage?
At the moment, the paper presented earlier is unclear as to whether water storage under the terms of our scheme, our program, is included, is up to 20,000 alongside septic tanks. I'm unclear about that because the paper's unclear. I've got contradictory information in this current paper, a la paragraph 39, that says that water storage is a maximum of 10,000. So I'm asking for staff to come back at the next meeting and confirm which of those scenarios applied, and if it is to be applied to water storage, what is the impact on the scheme?
Sorry, Chair, we can just clarify this. So it's just in the way that last sentence has been phrased, but the way it is supposed to read is that domestic water storage, clean heating, insulation, solar hot water are all 10,000, and for solar photovoltaic, double glazing septic tank, the limit's to 20,000.
That's correct.
So that's the current policy as proposed?
Well, no. If I can correct you there, by saying that the policy, when we look at page 5 of the Sustainable Homes Policy criteria, it says cost to HBRC, BRT fully recovered, minimum 10,000, max 20,000.
Councillor, you're quite correct. Water storage and septic tanks have been grouped into the same same thing. So yes.
So what I'm asking is, one is for certainty on that, and two, for staff to come back and report what the impacts would be if we included water storage up to 20,000 alongside septic tanks, solar voltaic, etc.
Okay.
Is that clear?
Can I have one point of clarification? Are you referring to water storage or water supply?
Well, you see, we've got another conflict in the criteria, as I questioned you earlier, where the boundary is. And you gave me an answer that said it would include, If I applied to you for a pump to pump water out of the ground, you said it would apply. Now, I'm hearing double responses here. Can you be clear on that?
I think, in answer to your point, it's the clarity that I'm seeking from council.
The council as
go
to
into the policy.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Well, Mr Chairman, if it's seeking information or confirmation, that doesn't bind us to anything. I've got no problem with that. I just would simply note that, 80 properties, $20,000 a pop, that's, what's that work out to?
1.6 million.
1.6 million, yeah.
It's a pretty good.
So do you want a number 4 to what you see up there?
Well,
This last issue?
if I could be explicit for the sake of staff trying to pull this together, and my recommendation is that staff provide advice as to the impact of confirming the maximum funding available for water storage is $20,000.
Okay, still provide advice.
Is the impact of confirming the advice.
Oh.
Confirming the maximum of $20,000, is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is.
Confirming the impact of confirming the impact of confirming the advice of the maximum is $20,000. That's what he said.
Still provide advice as to the impact of just
Confirming the maximum
The maximum.
This is ridiculous.
available
Yeah.
for water storage under the policy
Under the Sustainable Homes
and
policy.
sustainable
With
homes
sustainable
policy.
homes policy.
At $20,000.
With your permission, Chair, can we just go back to Rec 2? It seems a bit more directive there than what I recall Councillor Dick saying, which may in fact assuage.
He wanted to do it today, and you amended it back from that to get us some advice as to whether we should do it.
That's exactly my point.
Yeah.
That's exactly my point. So
Staff provide advice.
I'm assuaged concerns that Peter and others have expressed about being seen to take a decision on this effectively. So what I thought we were agreeing to was clear direction to try about come back to the next meeting with advice on this is rewording. This is the impression I have on advice on publicly notifying tranche 2 water allocation. So I didn't think we had made a decision to effectively, decide we're going to publicly notify, that we're going to have a paper for the staff to come back and tell us about it. And I would have thought in the paper they would have recommended yes or no.
That was indeed your rewriting of his motion.
But that's not what it says up there.
My interest is actually getting something decided upon, so if you'd like to alter the
What does that mean?
I just think
accordingly.
I just think that the staff report to the next council meeting on let's leave it open on whether or not tranche 2 allocation should be notified and the reasons for the reason for that. Does that get to us to it?
Well, look, we wouldn't, in terms of us providing advice on whether it should or it shouldn't, we wouldn't draw that conclusion until we're in the full receipt of the information requested under Section 92 of the Act. So it would be more advice on whether the council can or should make a preemptive policy around the public notification of these consents.
Well, if the council can, and the implications of doing so, should it decide to.
Yes, although we'll just need to check that you absolutely can. Look,
If you can,
yes.
and the implications, if they decide that you wish to, the implications of such a decision. Is that what we're saying?
Yes.
That's what you're saying. I seconded the original motion because I'm prepared today to say I don't see any information further coming under Section 92 that is going to change the material fact that today there is broad public interest in this matter being decided in a public manner. I don't need any more information to make that judgment today. So that's why I seconded Councillor Dick's original resolution, which was simply to take that action today.
Well,
You modified the resolution at my sufferance, and now we're in a conundrum here as to what exactly we want to put on the
Well, can I say, Chair, I will unsuffer you. I will relinquish my seconding to you. You can move it. I'm a bit more cautious on this.
We're going to, so back to Councillor Dick, having heard all this discussion, do you want to stick with your
Yes, I
original, or do you want to?
I'd suggest it should read, given the political sensitivity of the matter, that tranche 2 allocation applications, should they proceed, be publicly notified. Does that satisfy you?
That satisfies me.
And some people are going to
Chair,
vote against it or
Look, I'm getting some advice here that this might not be legally possible, particularly in this format. Just remind the committee that this is only a recommendation through the council anyway, whatever gets resolved today. If you do go down the track today of determining that you wish to set a policy on this, then we will bring back advice to the council meeting at the end of the month on whether or not you can continue down that path or not. So I guess to some extent you can resolve whatever you like in terms of a recommendation through the council, and we will provide advice in due course on that.
All right.
that'll do. Let's deal with it.
We do it?
See what result we get.
All right. So we're going to take these.
Monday.
Can I just say that that's your resolution there, so it should be moved Balfour, seconded. So moved.
Councillor Dick.
Moved Dick, seconded Balfour.
Can I also just
It's already
suggest that
carried, I see.
you may be prudent in replacing the words political sensitivity with public interest.
I would say community sensitivity itself.
Public interest.
Public interest is the word.
Public interest.
I'd like to get home.
In the public interest in the matter. On putting his lunchtime, too. All right, are we satisfied with the wording of these various?
Yes.
All right, so can we vote on number 1, receiving and noting the report? All those in
I
favor?
don't think we should receive it.
Okay. Number 2, given the interest, everybody sees what that is. All those in favor of that, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
So are you at 2?
We have some abstentions. So I think we're going to need a show of hands. All those
It doesn't need that. If you hear on the voices it's carried, it's carried. If someone says, I don't agree with that, they challenge it, and you then have a show of hands.
I don't agree with that.
Mr. Chairman. You're the chairman.
Motion carried.
Yeah, right, good.
What?
Number 3, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Abstain.
Opposed. Number 4, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Abstain.
So the only abstentions were,
From 2.
do need to be noted, right?
Yeah,
On number 2, and there was Debbie, Peter,
I've abstained from the whole lot.
With respect, it is, the motion's either carried or it's not. You just put down carried. You don't record abstentions.
I agree with that.
It's just carried. That's all it has to be. And then it's unclear as to what the majority was. And the only time you get recorded is if the matter's in dispute and someone who's in the minority who lost it says, I don't agree with your call there, Chair, and calls for a division. No division. So it's just carried.
That's fine. And I would ask the minutes to show that 3 councillors, 2 councillors abstained from item 2, and Fenton abstained for all votes.
On the whole day, I've followed Councillor Dick's lead and I want to go home.
And I said the Councillor Wilson should have his.
So I think we are ready for lunch.
The bottom one was Councillor Dick, who moved the whole lot.
Distributed that pay.
Slowed it down.
It's got different movers, which wasn't, is it having done?
All right.
I think he accepted that as,
That'll do.
Trying to pull the honey up, Chair.
Okay.
all right, we're going to take some lunch, assuming it's out there. I don't know.
Yes.
I come back from Hong Kong.
All right.
Have we got jurisdiction?
Everybody say it.
If I missed something,
No. I think he's off there doing some business.